And He has said to us, after examining us, after diagnosing our condition, He has said, I have some bad news and I have some good news. The bad news is that I've ruled out anything inexpensive. The good news is that once you apply the remedy, the blessing of the cure will make you forget the cost. We've been looking together at the subject of Christian joy, and we have seen that indeed it is a grace needed by God's people. It is a grace that is promised to God's people. But it is not always, and in some cases is not even regularly, our experience. That's the bad news. The good news is that that to be the case. There are causes, there are reasons for the decline of joy in the Christian life. Dealing with those reasons or causes is not cheap. If you desire to have Christian joy as part of a regular experience, I can tell you up front, you'll need to rule out anything inexpensive. There is a price to be paid. But when the remedy is applied, the blessing experienced will make you forget the cost. This afternoon we will look together at the reasons for joy's decline in the Christian experience. We'll seek to diagnose. We'll consider something of the bad news. And then, God willing, tonight we'll take up the remedy, the sources of joy's revival, and see that by the applying of the remedy, a costly remedy, in the applying of that remedy, there is indeed a great joy to be entered into. This afternoon, again, we look at the reasons for the decline of joy in the Christian's experience. The fact of declining joy is a reality that is familiar to many of us. Once we could say, and this is ordinarily the case, especially early in the Christian life, once we could say that though we did not see Christ, leaving, we rejoiced with joy inexpressible and full of glory. Do you remember those days? When, as a new convert, you felt like you were going to burst, and all your friends and all your relations, when they saw the joy that you were experiencing, thought you were crazy. Your experience was quite different from theirs. You seemed, at some level, to be out of your mind. And it's sad to say, brethren, that now we know seemingly very little of that blessing. Few would be the occasions when anyone would accuse us of being crazy with joy. What has happened? Every effect has a cause. That's the kind of world that we live in. That's the kind of world that God has designed. Every effect, physical or moral, has a cause. There are reasons for the decline of joy in the Christian experience. But what are they? What are those things that take from us that joy which Christ has promised to us? Again, to answer this question, I would have you to consider, first of all, that declining joy or a lack of joy in the Christian life is simply a symptom. It's not the cause itself. Those of you who have back problems, who suffer back pain, you know that that pain is not the problem. It's just the symptom. It is the most prevalent experience of the cause, but it's not the cause. The cause is something organic. Well, likewise, declining joy or declined joy in the Christian life, that's just the symptom. The causes of this, the underlying causes, are elsewhere. And these causes may even be hidden from ourselves as well as from others. So that as we pass day by day through our Christian experience, we are aware of the symptom. We're aware of our joylessness. We're aware ours is a spirit of heaviness. And yet we can't seem to place our finger on the cause. Well, the Bible does not leave us ignorant of these things. Now, my concern, brethren, is not to address the cases where there is a temporary loss of joy in the Christian life. That also is part of a normal Christian life. There will be seasons when you will experience, as of your reality as a Christian, a temporary loss of joy. And there are many things that can cause that. Sorrow for the loss of a loved one. The Bible does not command us to tutor ourselves emotionally. If we have suffered the loss of a dear one, it is not sinful to grieve. We should not consider our case to be desperate of a lack of joy in such a season. If you're lying flat of your back, overtaken by some illness, though we are to rejoice in tribulations, there's nothing indeed in the Bible that says that we are to be giggling in the midst of illness or injury. It's understandable that when the body is racked with physical pain, even as when the soul is racked with grief and sorrow, it's understandable there's going to be temporary loss of joy in its fullness. There are occasions when we are preoccupied with a difficult providence, some circumstance in our employment, something that's going on with one of our children that distresses us. Our fears for them are stirred up. The Christian life's not going to be happy-clappy in those kind of circumstances. But brethren, those kind of experiences are mere bumps in the road. They will cause a temporary loss of joy. But our concern is not with such passing moods, but with that persistent coldness of heart that robs us of our strength and makes all of our duties a burden. What takes the joy out of even holy things? What is it that takes the joy out of sacred, out of the reading of the Word, and out of prayer, and out of the fellowship of the brethren, and out of the worship of God and His service? What is it that reduces these things to drudgery? What dulls the sharpness of the word in our hearts so that we do not receive it with joy, as the Thessalonians did? What turns prayer into a burden? Worship into joyless formality? Well, the Bible tells us. And there's nothing mysterious in the Bible's diagnosis. And it begins with the reality of sin in the Christian life. More than any other cause, the Bible traces joylessness to sin. Now, does that surprise you? You think in this hour we were going to come to some secret that no one had yet discovered? That you were going to be hearing things that you've not heard 1,000 times before? No, the diagnosis is good. It's a diagnosis already known to us. The great robber of Christian joy is sin. A lack of joy is unresolved sin's inevitable result. It cannot be otherwise. Now, you will know the experience of David as he speaks of a season in which he has repented of great sin. And we read in Psalm 51, he asks the Lord, "Restore to me the joy of nation." But where had David's joy gone? The implication of his language is that the joy of his salvation was something that he once had experienced, that he once had relished. And he longs to see that reality restored. But where had his joy gone? Well, the Bible's answer to that question is that his conscience, vexed over his sin, had quenched his joy. Once he had rejoiced in the good things of God. Once he had rejoiced in walking with his God. But now joy has been replaced by a spirit of heaviness. What has happened? Sin has brought him to a state in which his conscience is vexed and it is declaiming against him. And it is literally stripping the joy out of his life. You know the context of David's prayer in Psalm 51. He's guilty of murder. He's guilty of adultery. And as the narrative unfolds, it appears that for almost a year, he has remained silent about this sin. He has covered it. But what had happened during that year? What had happened between the time that David engages in the sins of adultery and murder and the time that he pens the 51st Psalm, where he prays to the Lord, having confessed his sin, "Restore unto me the salvation." What had been his experience in the interim? Well, again, the Bible does not leave us without instruction. If you'll turn, please, to Psalm 32. It is generally agreed that this psalm was written, if not at this season, surely at a season where David was covering his sin. and where he had experienced the effect of that kind of spiritual deceit before God and before men. And he begins this psalm by saying, "Blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven." Under God's favor, he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Not covered by a blanket of deceit, but covered by the blood of atonement. Blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord does not impute iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. Blessed is the man who has ceased to play games in his conscience before God and before his fellow men. Now notice the language of verses 3 through 5. I kept silent. That is, when I did not confess my sins either to God or to men. When I kept silent, my bones grew old through my groaning all the day long. For day and night your hand was on me. My vitality, my moisture literally, was turned into the drought of summer. I acknowledged my sin to you, and my iniquity I have not hidden. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord. He forgave the iniquity of my sin. David describes a time, he says, when I kept silent. He describes a time when he did not acknowledge his sin to God. A time when he tried to heal his crimes. A time when the moral controversy that he had with God over the sins that he had committed, when that controversy was unresolved. And he says that in that season of time, his inner man began to wither. He says, my bones grew old, or as the old version says, my bones wasted away. The image is that of a man who is bowed down and crippled by his unconfessed sin. Who formerly was strong. A man who formerly in his soul was healthy. But now, because of his unconfessed sin, he is bowed down and his soul is withered within him. He is crippled spiritually. He says, my moisture, as with the drought of summer, while he kept silent. His spiritual life, his communion with God simply dried up. Now, to what did David attribute this degenerated spiritual state? Was David just out of sorts? Was he just having a bad year? Is that the explanation? Is that what has happened to David? No, he says it is to be to his groaning within him. Literally, he says, the roaring that is within me. When I kept silent, my bones grew old. Through my roaring all the day long. Now, what's the image? The image is that of a powerful lion. And that's how David thought of his conscience. A conscience that accused him. Though he did not confess the sin to God or man, his conscience accused him to his own heart. It roared within him. It groaned within him. His lips were silent. Conscience was not. Day by day, day and night, it roared against him with accusation and condemnation. Do you know how merciless conscience can be? I would never fall into the hands of an executioner that was like a conscience. For an executioner will simply drop the blade and cut off my head. But conscience is a merciless executioner. It suspends the blade day and night with the threatening of a terrible execution. And that's what David was experiencing. His conscience, him day and night, saying to him, you are a fraud. You are a murderer. You are an adulterer. You are a deceiver. And yet, as Israel's king, you come and go in your affairs. You present yourself as a godly man. Conscience is saying to him, we know better, don't we? You're a fraud, David. And you're not under God's favor, you're under His judgment because of your crime. He says, my bones wasted away through my roaring all the day long. He lived under a constant sense of estrangement from God. He lived under a constant sense of God's displeasure, and as long as his conscience roared against him, his spiritual life withered and wasted away. This was not a good year for David. There's nothing of joy in it. The constant roaring of his conscience. The withering of his joy, of course, was not the result of a self-inflicted psychosis. If David had applied to a local psychiatrist and said to him, I'm having these symptoms, I just don't seem to have any joy in my life anymore. Here's the diagnosis he would have gotten. David, the problem is you have inflicted yourself with a psychosis. It's all of those feelings. Get rid of the guilt feelings, and your problem will go away. But you see, the problem wasn't just guilt feelings. The problem was real guilt. Modification. No modification, chemical or otherwise, of the feelings was going to deal with the real issue, which was his real guilt. David came to see that what he was experiencing, yes, it was the result of his conscience bearing down upon him and day and night accusing him of the reality of his unrepented and unresolved sin. But David lifted his eyes beyond that and understood that, in fact, the hand of God was upon him. It wasn't just David against David. It was God's hand that was heavy upon him. Day and night, he says, your hand was heavy upon him. And he understood that there was no other explanation for his condition. It could be accounted for in no other way than that God's powerful, chastening hand was disciplining him. There's a comparable in Psalm 38. And please turn there. Again, a Psalm of David. We're not sure of the precise setting, the precise time or circumstances in David's life to which this psalm is attached. But notice the language. It's a similar experience to what he described in 32. Lord, do not rebuke me in your wrath, nor chasten me in your hot displeasure. For your arrows David here also understands this is not just me. I'm having dealings with God. It says, for your arrows pierce me deeply, and your hand presses me down. There is no soundness in my flesh because of your anger, nor any health in my bones because of my sin. For my iniquities have gone ahead like a heavy burden. They are too heavy for me. My wounds are foul and festering because of my foolishness. I am troubled. I am bowed down greatly. I go mourning all the day long. For my loins are full of inflammation. There is no soundness. I am feeble and severely broken. I groan because of the turmoil of my heart. Lord, all my desire is before you, and my sighing is not hidden from you. My heart pants. It fails me. As for the light of my eyes, it is almost gone from me. Here is a man who is under the chastening hand of God. In the matter of the sin against Uriah and Bathsheba, David had tried to deceive himself. He had tried to cover his sin. He had tried to ignore the reality and the gravity of what he had done. But God would not let it go. And he stirred up David's conscience against him, to such a degree that it was nothing less than the heavy hand of God upon him day and night. God, his guilt before the judgment bar of his conscience, so that David could not silence his conscience. It was God's hand that withheld from him peace and the joy of his salvation. Sin is the great robber of Christian joy. David's case is conspicuous, but it's not at all unusual. To one degree or another, most of us have experienced what David here describes. Perhaps we are not guilty of murder or adultery or some other openly scandalous sin. Sins, nonetheless, have given us an accusing conscience that will not be silent and cannot be silenced day and night. Our sins have brought God's chastening hand upon us, so that our joy, no small of our vitality as Christians, is dried up as the drought of summer. The Bible traces joylessness to unresolved sin. No grand revelation in that, is there, brethren? It's the first place, not the last place, that we ought to go looking when we're looking for the cause of joylessness. But now consider secondly, and this is a related idea, but I want to track it out on its own merit. The Bible traces joylessness to worldliness. Now, obviously, these are connected. But here is the question I want to pose at this juncture. Christian, are you seeking your portion in the things of this world? But you are finding nothing but vanity and emptiness. Are you seeking for your portion of happiness and joy in the things of this world, but are finding instead nothing but vanity and emptiness. Are you trying to use, to put the question another way, are you trying to use the empty joys of this world to warm the coldness of your heart? Are discovering with each attempt and each experiment that it is like stepping into a freezer instead? Joy cannot be found in the things of the world. Don't be surprised by that. Great masters in worldliness have explored the whole subject thoroughly. If you'll turn, please, to Ecclesiastes chapter 2, we have the example of Solomon. He was a man who had unlimited resources. It is said that the silver in his kingdom was not even counted. He had unlimited wealth. He had unlimited power. And one of the lessons that the book of Ecclesiastes teaches us is what happens when a man who possesses that kind of resources invests them in the seeking of joy in the things of the world. Solomon tells us that he made a grand experiment. No one before him, no one after him has been able to make a grander experiment in happiness in the things of this world. Now hear his conclusion. For Solomon tells us he has learned, as the result of that grand experience and that grand experiment, an experiment that you will never be able to duplicate. We will never have the material resources that Solomon had. Any experiment in finding joy and in worldliness by us is going to be, in fact, amateurish compared to a pro like Solomon. So let's learn from him. For he had an assessment of what he had learned from that experiment. Ecclesiastes 2, beginning in verse 1, Solomon says, "In my heart, come now, I will test you with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure." What's Solomon saying? He's saying that it has been suggested to me, it seems to think that if life is a party, then certainly there will be joy. So Solomon turned his life into a continual party. He says, "I will test my heart with mirth." He did. The finest of the pleasures that the world had to offer. Solomon tried them all. He tried them all not merely with a mere sampling, the full. Our culture has the idea that if life were just a continual party, we would be happy. What was Solomon's response? His experience. He says, "Come now, I will test you with mirth," he says to his heart, "therefore enjoy pleasure." But surely this also was vanity. It was emptiness. He came away from that experience utterly empty. There was no enduring joy in any of it. He goes on. "I said of laughter, madness. And of mirth, what does it accomplish? There came a point in his life when he was ready to acknowledge this experiment has been an utter failure. I have acted like a madman. If Solomon had had a dictionary, he would have said, open the dictionary to the word fool or madman and you'll see a picture of Solomon. I tried it all. There was nothing. Nothing whatever. He says, I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom. In other words, he says, I did this deliberately. This was a deliberate experience, an experiment. I deliberately went down the path of chemical alteration of the mind and the emotions. He says, I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine while guiding my wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the sons of men to do under heaven all the days of their lives. Solomon thought, well, if I can be disconnected from reality, maybe in that disconnect from reality, I'll find joy. And I'll find what all men ought to be doing. I can remember as a young man, my mother inquiring of me, very concerned, because I was using drugs. This was the 60s, not the best decade. And she said to me, if it's such a great thing, let me. I couldn't conceive of that. My mom smoking dope. But you see, if in fact that mind-altering experience was the key to happiness, why should I keep it from my mother? Solomon says, I tested my heart with wine. At the end of the day, nothing. Nothing of joy. Nothing of enduring value. Nothing worth having came out of that experience. And then he turns another corner, verse 4. I made my works great. I built myself houses and planted myself vineyards. I made myself gardens and orchards. I had all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made myself water pools from which to water the growing trees of the grove. I acquired male and female servants and had servants born in my house. Yes, I had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all who were in Jerusalem before me. I also gathered myself silver and gold and the special treasures of kings and of providences. I acquired male and female singers, the delights of the sons of men, and musical instruments of every kind. Solomon's experiment extended his occupation, if you will. He was a king, after all. He had unlimited resources. Well, what do kings with unlimited resources do? If you read the travels of Marco Polo, it's a very boring book, by the way. But if you read the book, and over, he describes the wealth of Kublai Khan. But not just his wealth, but the great projects that he constructed in an effort to get a name for himself and to lay hold upon something of enduring value. And Solomon tried that. He built great houses. He built great stables. He established great farms. He surrounded himself with servants. He had the best entertainment in the land. And at the end of the day, all that he had accomplished was nothing. He wasn't any happier or joyful than when he started. He says, so I became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. He says, I still knew what I was doing. See, that's the thing. Solomon did this deliberately. He didn't just fall in pyramid. He didn't just trip into worldliness. He did it deliberately. With premeditation. Premeditated to use all of his resources and all of his energy and all of his strength to finding something in the world worth living for and living by. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure. My heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward from all my labor. He says, I looked at all that I had accomplished. And he says, I looked on all the works that my hands had done and on the labor in which I had toiled. And indeed, all was vanity, all was empty and a grasping for wind. He says, and it was like a man trying to capture the wind in his hand. It was all a grasping after wind. There was no profit for his soul under the sun. In this grand experiment that he had accomplished. He had learned, by the time he writes Ecclesiastes, he had learned about the emptiness of earthly things by sad experience. He had not found in the reputed joys of this world of the joy that he had sought. All of the effort, all of the energy, all of the resources that he had expended, and what was his reward? Well, only a temporary joy, but in the end, only vanity and a grasping of the wind. He had everything that the world had offered. Everything that the world had said had any promise whatever of enduring joy. But there was no solid joy in any single thing that he had tried. He went away empty. He went away wiser, but he went away with an empty heart. My friends, are you making a grand experiment with the world? And I pose this question to unconverted, but to converted. Are you making your own experiment with the world? Please understand that all the reputed joys of this world combined, wrap it all up in a great big package and put a bow on it. All of the joys of this world combined cannot produce the joy that you crave and you need. In fact, the more you experiment with these things, the colder your heart is going to be, and the further your joy is going to decline. See, a soul that feeds on the world must needs be hungry. For there's nothing in the world, brethren, fit food for the soul. There's nothing in the things of the world, nothing of any of the things in this world that you can yearn after and labor after and expend your energy and your resources after. None of that is fit food for your soul. And if you throw yourself into that kind of life, if it is a life of continual pursuing after the things of this world, your soul must be empty. It can't be otherwise. You're trying to grasp the wind. Take your joys from this world, and your life must be joyless. That's reality. It's a reality that every unconverted person and every Christian should seriously think upon. What has your experiment gained for you just to this point? Anything? Or are you as empty as you started? The Bible traces joylessness to worldliness. And then finally, brethren, and much more briefly, we'll look at this, God willing, tonight as we look at the other side of this principle. But the Bible traces this to a neglect of the means of grace. Another surprise. Pastor Martin, we didn't expect things so familiar to us. You're telling us that unresolved sin and a heart that's running after the world and a neglect of the means of grace will destroy joy in the Christian life. You saying that's it? That's it. Nothing mysterious. Nothing that's not lying on the very source of the Scriptures. Nothing that in our heart of hearts, brethren, we don't know already. See, this is why I said to you that the cure will not be inexpensive. But the cure will make the cost worth it. It's not inexpensive to deal with sin before God and before men. It's not inexpensive to mortify a worldly heart. And it's not inexpensive to be diligent and faithful in the use of the means of grace to the degree that real fruit and joyfulness can be produced. Consider here, however, brethren, in closing, that since Christian joy is a work of grace in our hearts, and we'll explore that a bit next time. In some cases, then, not in every case, in some cases, a decline of joy, a decline of that grace and that experience in our heart is to be traced to no more mysterious cause than our own sin. Deal with the sin. Clear your conscience before God and before man on a solid biblical foundation. Don't just bludgeon your conscience into silence, but deal with it biblically, and the joy will come back. Turn away from the world, and the effect is almost automatic. Joy will grow. Likewise, brethren, since joy is a work of grace in our hearts, in some cases, its decline is directly related to the neglect of the means appointed by God for having it. God has appointed means for having a consistent experience of joy. Not, again, a perfect experience of joy. We're not talking about heaven. We're talking about now. And there are means that God has appointed for possessing this. And the question is, are you being faithful? Are you being diligent? Are you expending energy in the direction of using the means that God has given you? And those means are not unknown to you. They're not unknown to me. Meditation on the Word, prayer, the worship of God, the fellowship of the saints. If we're not being diligent in the use of these means, as the Puritans would have said, if we're not being diligent in the improvement of these means, then it's no mystery that we will forfeit the joy that these means are meant to produce. It's no mystery. There's a passage that we've not touched on thus far in Psalm 16 and verse 11. And I want you to turn there because I want you to see with your eyes there's a benefit to not only hearing the word with the ear, but seeing the word come through the entrance of the eye. I want these words to be deeply impressed upon your conscience. Psalm 16:11, David says to the Lord, "In your presence is fullness of joy." In your presence is fullness of joy. Now follow with me. In one way or another, all of the means of grace, meditation on the Word, prayer, the fellowship of the etc., in one way or another, all of those means of grace are a means of drawing near to God. They are a means to reverse the image of a laying hold of God and bringing Him near. All of them are means by which we experience the immediate presence of God. And if we neglect those means, God will be distant. And there with Him, us, but with Him, brethren, will be that joy in His presence which is our strength. Neglect the means, all of which are a means of coming into the presence of God in a vital and a living way. Neglect those means, and is it conceivable that God should be, in our experience, anything but distant? And that with Him there, not with Him here, but with Him there, is what we so much need. And the joy that He has promised. Is your joy declining? Is your joy gone? There's no mystery. Unless it's one of those temporary bumps in the road. The issue is either sin or worldliness or neglect of the means of grace. Say, Pastor, where did you get those ideas? I'll tell you how I got those ideas. The best way to study the Bible on a subject like this is to look at every passage in the Scripture that deals with the subject of joy and see what things God links it to. These are the things that God links a decline of joy to. Worldliness and neglect of the means of grace. Is your joy declining? Is it gone? My brethren, there, in one of those categories, is the diagnosis. These are the great spoilers of Christian joy. And these are the things that you must address if you are to see joy's revival and the return to a healthy, normal Christian life. And that's our theme next time. Joy, a grace needed by God's people. I hope we're convinced we need it. If your mind isn't convinced, your heart is. Joy is a grace promised to God's people as part of the wondrous work of Christ the Anointed. There are reasons why it's missing. That's the bad news. We've ruled out anything inexpensive. But the good news is sources for its reviving. There is a medicine or medicines to be taken. And if we will take them and follow the great physician's directions, just do what the doctor says, we will yet enter circumstance, brethren, where we will look upon the cost as trivial compared to the benefit received. Are you with me so far? All right.